Coming up on this week's edition of Sunday Nation, you will meet a 90-year-old Lena Nichols, one of the oldest black residents here in the city of Westland. She turned 90 this week, and she blessed us with a visit to our studios. She came all the way from Arkansas and moved to Michigan in 1952. She's telling her story here on the program. And of course, the United Nations this week held a remembrance of the history of the transatlantic slave trade. We'll do some reflections on that, but we begin with the Reverend Solomon W. Kinloch Jr., the senior pastor of Triumph Church, one of the fastest growing churches here in the country and the largest black church here in Michigan. It's all coming up on this week's edition of Sunday Nation. Stay with us. I'm Bankole Thompson. Welcome back to Sunday Nation. Let's bring in the Reverend Solomon W. Kinloch Jr., the senior pastor of Triumph Church, which is regarded as the fastest growing black church here in the country. Thank you so much for being here, Reverend.
I'm good. I'm glad to be here.
I want to begin with, been meaning to talk to you about just how the black church has transitioned from COVID to where you are now. But let's just do a quick excursion to pre-COVID, what the black church, where it was, and where it is now.
Well, one of the things,
I mean, through your ministry, though, because I think people say you're all over the place, you're everywhere.
Okay. Well, one of the things I have to attribute that to is the rearing and raising, my exposure, my experience in the metropolitan area.
Yeah.
I grew up in an environment and at a time where the church theology impacted our sociology. How we studied and worshiped God also motivate us and how we ought to serve our God, but also how we ought to assist and help our fellow man. And so I always have been reared and raised, and I am at a point in a place in my life, along with the people that our partner and our pastor, we believe that the church's platform should be used not to just lift an individual. The privatization of religion has messed up the church. This me, mine, I, where it's your time, it's your turn. We believe that the platform ought to be used in order to lift not just a person, but an entire community of people, because that's been our exposure and our experience.
Yeah, you know, and it's interesting you say that, though, because it's as if the role of the church, the black church, has kind of evolved over the years, and we've seen ministers come and go. And we point to history, to great black churches, and I'm thinking about, the Abyssinia Baptist Church, where Dr. Calvin Butts, who just passed away, and I watched the eulogy that Reverend McMichaels.
Marvin Mack.
Yeah, that's
Nichols,
right. And so we point to history, and the question now becomes this: what is the church today doing, the black church?
Well, one of the mistakes we can't make is putting people, preachers, pastors, on pedestals. We got to remember that we use our platform not for ourselves, but to lift an entire community and generation of people. And that's where I believe the change and the shift has got to revert back to. This cannot be about us, but it has to be about how God can use us in order to serve mankind.
Right. And I want to explore that a little bit. We're going to come to the COVID impact, because I really want to talk to you about it, about just how the COVID has impacted the church and whether the church, in fact, has resurrected out of COVID. I know we're coming to Resurrection Week. This is your week. But just to stay on the black church, though, when you look at it nationally and here within Michigan and in Detroit, do you feel that it's still a sleeping giant?
Well, we grew up in a time, in an era, where we knew who our leaders were. And we knew that when our leaders walked into the room, when they sat down at the table, they weren't so intoxicated and they weren't so inebriated with being close to the proximity and the vicinity of power that they forgot the reason they showed up in the room in the first place. They used their position, their influence, in order to bring about change in our community. And one of the things that even in the time that we're in right now, I believe that corporate and community can make great partnerships together. But we have to make sure that we got great representation at the table who can remember and recollect and recall when they're having these discussions and these dialogues why they're in the room in the first place.
That's interesting because, you know, it's always been about who is negotiating on behalf of black folk in the room. And, you know, business leaders and companies and mayors and governors always come to pastors. They will come to black ministers because you have a captive audience every Sunday.
Well, Dr. King taught it best. Dr. King said, you know, any religion that is not concerned about the economic conditions that cripple it in the social deconstruction that's going on around the church is a church that's in supply and in need of a new supply of blood, because it's not the church that Jesus gave his life for. We have a responsibility. If we are the vehicle in which God manifests his hands and his feet in the earth, that gets us even back to COVID. COVID was a battleground. It wasn't a playground. And so when you're in a fight and you're confronted with a mammoth and a Herculean crisis like that, the church can't afford to run from the battlefield, not when you're seeing people in devastation and disaster. Our responsibility is what we decided to do, run to the front of the battlefield and make sure that our people know that they weren't there by themselves, that they had those of us partnering with them.
And I know you've had to deal with a lot of our homegoing services, and sometimes I can, you know, I wonder what is in the mind of a minister who presides over this many moments of sadness where you basically have to shepherd people into some sort of a state of comfort, not only once a week, but 3-4 times a week during COVID.
Well, we have to remind ourselves and we have to remind other people that we can make it without a lot of things, Bankole, but we can't make it without hope. And one of the things that confronts us when we get down to those hours that is known as death is that family matters, friendship matters, but also having a deep faith matter. Because when you're confronted with moments like that, that's the only thing that can give you the will and the motivation to make it through, is knowing that this ain't it, that there's something better for us on the other side.
Yeah, remarkable. Now on COVID, the first question I asked you here, and that is just the pandemic, the impact. We've seen, you know, I don't want to, you know, use the word perhaps say that some black churches have bitten the dust, but I think some churches have been struggling to adapt to COVID. But your ministry is also a digital ministry as well as a physical ministry. Talk about how you've been able to really navigate the challenges that COVID brought and have a ministry that people look up to.
Well, you got to admit, before March 2020, we never would have fathomed or imagined something like this could even take place. This was a depiction or a scene out of some scientific movie. And so we woke up in March 2020 and the world had just changed. And what we had to do is use that opportunity, not just confronting it as just opposition, but an opportunity to intensify the work that we were already doing. And so when the directive came down and the government directives came down, what we decided to do is use it as an opportunity to send a bold message that God is still in control. And although it's a moment that looked as though it was beyond our ability to manage, that we served a God that can bring it under his control. And so we were able to transition. When we could not worship inside a sanctuary, we held drive-ins on a weekly basis. We hosted drive-in worship service. We hosted drive-in Bible study. We even had a Martin Luther King breakfast where they pulled up and drive-in and we fed them by partnering with local businesses, because it wasn't just churches, local businesses that were projecting that 40% of the businesses weren't going to survive. And so during that particular time, the membership of Triumph Church stepped up, the community stepped up and allowed us to partner with businesses to keep them afloat, but at the same time partner with grocery stores, and we were able to purchase groceries in order to distribute it to the community. We were able to stay in touch and engage. Before COVID, we were not doing television. Now we're on television 3 days a week. Before COVID, we had very little and minimum social platform. But we had people that were in the home. They couldn't get to a particular building because of what was going on. And so we seized every opportunity and used every platform at our disposal and discretion in order to make sure that we can keep people connected. People needed hope. All of us needed hope because that's the only way that we were going to survive this thing. We had to come together to do it.
Yeah. Have you had calls from other ministers around the country asking you how do you do it? How did you do it?
Well, there's been a lot of conversation around the country. Not just pre-COVID, mid-COVID, but also even what we've seen to be coming out of post-COVID as it relates to what's going on right now. Everyone is just trying to figure out how to adapt and what we call the new norm. Because there's a new norm. COVID is still here, but how do we continue to function and continue to move forward in the midst of what we still are in? I want to talk about, and you alluded to this in your earlier remarks here on the program, and that is just the role of the church, the role of the preacher here, because sometimes, you know, when people lose hope, when, you know, they feel like they feel dejected, you know, they run to the church, they run to the pastor, and they believe that their pastors will do the right thing. They believe that the church will stand with them and do the right thing. You know, whether it's the issue of economic inequality, you know, in terms of how, you know, what they're dealing with within the city, I mean, within a given state, you know, whether it's related to the mayor, to the governor, and so forth, people always run to their pastors. How important is it, though, for you, you know, as a minister of the gospel, to do what you do, driven by what you're called to do, and not simply, you know, what we sometimes see as just political expediency? Well, we have to make a decision whether we want to be popular or whether we want to be respected. Because sometimes the people that like us won't respect us, and sometimes the people that respect us will not like us. And as ministers of the gospel, we're called to speak truth to power. We have to make sure that our governmental leaders and all of us are not just presenting symbolism, but that we're presenting real substantive and structural change. We were already in a difficult place before COVID. We already were faced and confronted with all type of disparities in our community, whether you talk about educational, whether you talk about environmental, whether you talk about social, whether you talk about financial, whether you talk about criminal. We were already confronted with all type of disparity, housing, food insecurity. All of that was going on in the community before COVID. COVID didn't just uncover some stuff, COVID exasperated all of those existing conditions. And so as leaders in our community, we have got to make sure that our leaders are not just showing up, our political leaders and corporate leaders are not just showing up making promises that they're not going to deliver on, because I think there's an opportunity for tremendous partnership, but we got to make sure that we are attacking the structural issues, the systematic issues. We got to make sure that we're putting things in place that really deals with the root of the problem.
And you sit as the senior pastor at Triumph Church in the nation's largest, biggest city. And, you know, I can't say that enough, because we always talk about Detroit being the largest African-American city. And the role of the black church could not be overemphasized, anymore underscored, and so forth. But I'm just thinking about where do you see Detroit 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Where would you like it to be? What would you like to see?
Well, one of the things that we got to do is come up with an intentional strategy to deal with poverty. Because unless we come up with an intentional strategy, that's why I am so humbled and honored to see what you're doing with the Post Institute, because we have to be more intentional about our dealing with poverty. If we don't get a handle on poverty in the metropolitan area, and particularly around the country and around the world, you're never going to be able to deal with issues such as crime, such as the mis and under education of our young people, because those are all going to be residuals of not dealing with poverty. What I would like to see over the next 5 years is a reconditioning of mindsets, of us understanding what COVID should have taught us, that we can do far more together than we can alone. But we have got to rally around an agenda that is beneficial for the whole community, and not just walking out of the room with items, products, and services that benefit an individual, but that benefit us all.
And you know, the irony is that so many of the issues that Detroit is dealing with, when you divide the issues, or when you divide the individuals who are affected by those issues, they belong to so many churches.
Yes.
I mean, these are your parishioners
Yes.
who are dealing with the day-to-day struggles.
Yeah. Dr. Frederick Sampson used to say it best. He said the church's address is just a compilation of multiple addresses. And so we cannot just be so inebriated spiritually with divine ecstasy on Sunday morning that we forget that there are people who are still hurting and still in need down in the valley. And that morning, Sunday morning service ought to be a catalyst in order to initiate and instigate all of us to move with power and dignity into our communities and see how we can come up with real substantive change in order to make the quality of life better for us all. Because I can't just go home to my house and get in my car and be concerned about just my son. None of us, that's a moral and a Christian responsibility. None of us can go home and be happy until all of God's children have a home to go home to.
And as you're speaking, I'm thinking about just so many other ministers in the past who have talked about just the importance of the black church flexing its power, you know, from, you know, theologians, Kane Hopfelder, James Cone, all these great black theologians of the past who have just made the case that the black church has power and it can exercise that power.
And we got to get to a point where we stop letting other people speak for us.
Yeah.
We have a voice, and we have got to start using that voice in order to bring about real change.
Yeah.
It's sad when we get to a point where our leaders who are responsible to articulate and communicate that, we're not just responsible for convening the tables, we're also responsible for communicating the needs when we come to the table. And in order to do that, we have to have courage. We have to have integrity. Dr. King and leaders that came before us understood something, that this is a cause that you got to be willing to give your life to. He taught us that if a man hasn't found something to die for, he's not fit to live. And as a preacher, we got to understand that we got to stand before our master one day, and we want to hear him say that we did a job well done because we've been faithful over what he's charged us with. And so that's why every chance I get, I use the platform that God has given me in order to bring about change to my community, in order to help my fellow brothers and sisters, in order to replicate in other lives what God and so many other people have helped happen in my own life.
The other side to this is that, you know, we talk about just how significant the black church is, and sometimes how we feel like the black church hasn't done much. And you make the case here, outside of our community, I mean, folk watching, they know the importance of black church. You know, that's why the politicians come. That's why they want to come to the black pulpit. That's why they want to partner with the black church, because they understand the importance that the black church plays.
Yeah, well, you have voters that sit in that seat. You have taxpayers that sit in that seat. You have volunteers that sit in that seat. You have people that they are called to serve that sit in that seat. Let's be honest, we've been the victims of the cold winds of racism and the chilling winds, sometime of conservatism that beat upon this land. And all of us want to be in a land of equality, where there's a sharing of the commonwealth, where there's a sharing of the common land. And it has been stated and defined that here is supposed to be a land where every man has the unalienable right to pursue happiness in his own individual way. And those that are elected to those seats of power got to always be held accountable to make sure that they're doing what the premise of government was built upon in order to protect the weak from the strong.
Yeah, yeah, remarkable. And I'm going back to Calvin Butts and just what he did in New York, and it's been lifted up as an example here. Detroit, the nation, Detroit was once looked upon as a leader in these issues. You mentioned Fred Sampson and some other great ministers, the late P.A. Brooks, Bishop P.A. Brooks and others.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, though,
Yeah.
as you reflect on that, do you feel that Detroit is on that map, can be on that map again?
I believe that God is raising up.
Where it is seen as this mentor when it comes to, you know, effective, consensus black church leadership. That speaks to power.
With a conscious social conscience.
Yes.
That understand that how we study and how we worship
Right.
ought to motivate us to
Right.
bring about real change
Yeah.
in the community. I believe that there are good pastors in the city of Detroit. I
Yeah.
know good men and women
Yeah.
who serve in the pulpit with dignity and integrity
Right.
in this town and across the country. But I'm also excited because if we're not enabling, if we're not equipping, if we're not empowering those to do that is coming behind us to do what we're doing right now, then what we're doing right now will die when we die. Right. And the testament to any great leader is to make sure that you're training and you're empowering. And so I am hopeful because I see young men and young women on the horizon who are not going to settle and who not going to just sit by, but they're going to be a part of writing the narrative because it's a tragedy whenever you let people start coming up with plans and programs for your life and you are not even pulled into the conversation. Yeah. You are not even part of the discussion. We have got to make sure that we write our own narrative and stop letting other people write it for us. And I'm hopeful when I see young people coming up that is not settling for nothing less than that.
Well, thank you so much for being here.
I'm excited.
The Reverend Solomon W. Kinloch Jr., Senior Pastor at Triumph Church, one of the fastest growing churches here in the country. When we come back from the break, the United Nations this week held a remembrance of the transatlantic slavery. We'll have some reflection and, of course, on the history of one of the heinous crimes in human history. Stay with us.